Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about why alcohol is not your friend. So the format is I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. I'm certainly welcome to questions being written down as I'm talking, and I'll try to get to them at the end. Or you can wait to the end and write them down then. If there aren't any questions, then this will end after about 15 to 20 minutes, and it will be posted here on the website. We're also working on posting them to YouTube, so that may be available. And next week's topic, I will be getting more into some of the information in my book, specifically how we know that Donald Trump has ADHD. So lots of other organizations are currently telling people alcohol is not their friends. I just saw that the American Cancer Society is recommending, after a number of studies showing that even moderate drinking is associated with increased risk for a number of different cancers, no drinking at all. But I'm going to be speaking more about why for mental health, and particularly ADHD and depression, alcohol is not your friend. So part of the framing for this is that those with ADHD, partly because they make more impulsive decisions, partly because they weigh the immediate benefits more highly than long-term consequences, are more prone to substance abuse disorders, including alcohol addiction. Studies show that youngsters with ADHD start drinking alcohol at an earlier age. They wind up drinking more alcohol and are more likely to have binge drinking episodes, and are, in some studies, more likely to show impairment from the alcohol. So in a sort of feedback loop, alcohol itself worsens impulsiveness, decreases focus. Long-term effects of alcohol seem to decrease cognition, decrease memory, and all of those are systems that seem to have some impairment in ADHD. Further, alcohol has prominent effects on sleep. So we know one of the maybe good things I'll say, and this is not really a good thing, alcohol does measurably help people fall asleep. If you carry to an extreme, if you drink enough, you do pass out. Alcohol does have sedative properties. But even when it's just a drink or two of alcohol, drink a bottle of beer, glass of wine, we know that alcohol, in addition to making it easier to fall asleep, does disrupt the deeper stages of sleep, particularly REM sleep. It suppresses that, and REM sleep, as we talked about in some of the last few sessions, is critically important for emotional well-being the next day, for control over your emotions, for assessing other people's emotions, and measures of creativity seem to be impaired in people who have REM sleep deprivation. And REM sleep seems to be important for synthesizing the events of your day and consolidating them into a coherent way of living. So I'll say a little bit about stimulant medications and alcohol, because some people think, alcohol is a depressant, and stimulants are stimulating me, revving me up. Don't they just cancel out each other's effects? Doesn't that let me drink more alcohol or use more ADD medication to counter it? And one of the things we know is that they don't just neutralize each other, that the more you drink, one is that alcohol itself can elevate blood levels of Ritalin to some extent, maybe as well for dextroamphetamine. But we do know that alcohol impairs your ability to know how much of your stimulant you've taken and what you're doing with it. And the stimulants do make it harder to know how impaired you are from alcohol. So they are not just canceling out each other's effects, they are sort of both impairing the brain in different ways. But the biggest chunk of what I'm going to talk about today, because it's been more studied in detail, and unfortunately it isn't consolidated in just one place, but there is a wealth of data on why alcohol is not good for any brain that's prone to depression. And we know that those with depression are people, ADHD and depression tend to go together. That some studies suggest that as many as a third of people who are presenting with depression have ADHD concomitantly with it. And we know if you have ADHD, your risk for developing depression is increased 2 or 3-fold. So what we know specifically looking at alcohol and depression, there's a couple completely separate lines of evidence telling us why alcohol is bad news for depression. So first line of evidence comes from studies done on people who are serious alcoholics drinking massive amounts of alcohol, the ones you see passed out on the sidewalk or developing cirrhotic livers and other health complications from long-term massive amounts of drinking. And for decades, we've known that massive amounts of drinking is correlated with substantially higher rates of depression. But for years, some researchers and some clinicians sort of dismissed this, saying, most of these chronic alcoholics are men, at least they're overrepresented in that population, and maybe some of these people men were actually depressed to begin with, and that they're used alcohol to deal with their feelings, and it was only over more time that it became apparent that they were indeed depressed. So maybe it wasn't that massive amounts of alcohol were causing depression, maybe it was these were depressed people. And over the last decade, we've had several studies done in different parts of the world, all very rigorously looking at people at the beginning of this long study periods, and assessing and finding that people who had no signs, no indications of depression early on, but who wound up drinking heavily and becoming alcoholics, substantially disproportionate number of those people did go on to develop depression. So yes, we know that depression can cause excessive drinking, but we do definitively know that huge amounts of drinking do lead to depression at higher rates than the background population has, and also accounting for other co-founding factors. So that's massive amounts of drinking. Probably most of you are not doing massive amounts of drinking, although again, studies do suggest that people with ADHD have less ability to assess accurately how much they're drinking, just as they are less attentive and paying less attention to some other aspects of what's going on with their body or their own behavior. But what do we know about moderate drinking? And social drinking is defined in most studies in the last decade or two as having 2 or 3 drinks 2 or 3 times a week. So that doesn't sound excessive, 4 to 9 drinks a week. And we have dozens of studies looking at people being treated for depression on antidepressants from every single class of antidepressants we have. And the studies show the population that has depression is on an antidepressant and is doing social drinking gets less benefit from the antidepressants than the group of people who are complete teetotalers and taking the drug. So even social amounts of drinking, 2 to 3 drinks, 2 to 3 times a week, are, and again, given that it's from different classes of medications, this is not a alcohol SSRI interaction, this is not an alcohol monoamine oxidase or alcohol tricyclics or alcohol and Wellbutrin interaction. This is pretty clearly an effect of alcohol on the brain. And again, it doesn't completely block the ability of antidepressants to work, but antidepressants don't work to the same extent or as fully. And part of why that's crucial is one of the things we know about treating depression is that when we get people completely out of depression, so not just an improvement, but a complete remission, the rate of future depressions is substantially reduced. Whereas just helping them somewhat, yeah, that's good, but it's not that great or not as good as it could be, because residual symptoms of depression are the best predictor for more depression down the line. So that's sort of epidemiologic data, even in the age of COVID, where we're flooded with epidemiologic data. That doesn't wow too many people or convince too many people. We're no longer in the decade of the brain, but still brain and neuroscience-based arguments seem to sway more people I've worked with. So we do have a wealth of neuroscience data, and I'm going to try to be careful here in clarifying when I'm saying things, what we know is fact or observation, and what I am and others have put together as convincing story that makes sense, but maybe we don't have absolute confirmation of the truth of some of the things I'll be saying. So one of the things we know is true, the most consistent finding in all of biological psychiatry for the last 30, 40 years is that long-term depression and long-term anxiety are associated with atrophy of a certain part of the brain, which is a certain part of the hippocampus, not the whole hippocampus, but a subset of the hippocampus. And the longer the depression, the longer the severe anxiety, the more atrophy and shrinkage in this part of the brain. Most studies indicate that this is probably due to brain cell damage and actual brain cell neuronal death in this part of the hippocampus. And this is a part of the hippocampus that is involved not just in memory, but emotional regulation itself. So it may not be just a marker for depression, it may be part of the whole causing depression process. So what's that have to do with alcohol? So alcohol, you've been told since you were a little kid, alcohol kills brain cells, and it's sort of ha ha ha, that's a joke. So what if it's killing brain cells? We know we have 1 trillion or so when we're born, and by the age of 2 or so on, we're constantly killing off brain cells, which is true. Part of a maturing brain is getting rid of or pruning systems or pathways that we're not using, we're not employing. But in addition to just randomly killing brain cells, one of the things that alcohol does is there are a few parts of the brain that are specifically sensitive to alcohol. One of those areas is the mammary bodies, but another area is this exact same subset of the hippocampus. So the thought is, if you are doing even social amounts of drinking and alcohol together, if you're doing alcohol and have depression or anxiety together, both of those are killing off brain cells in this exact same part of the hippocampus, and you get into more of a deficit. You're doing sort of a double whammy. You're killing off more brain cells. You're causing brain damage, is what I'm telling you. Most people are horrified at the brain damage storyline. There is a silver lining to the story, and that is in the human brain, most studies, there's a few that would disagree, but it seems that the best area in the human brain for making new brain cells is this exact same subset of the hippocampus. So the thought is that people who are just drinking moderately, much of society can get away with some alcohol use because the brain does have some rejuvenating, restorative, regenerative capacity in this part of the hippocampus. And you're sort of making up as many as you're losing. But again, if you're killing them off at a faster rate because you have both depression or anxiety or combined with alcohol killing them off, then you're getting into a further and further deficit. So I'd say your brain does not want you to be drinking. I'll jump lastly into the fourth line of evidence. So all the things I've been saying, that the chronic alcoholics, the moderate alcohol use in people on antidepressants, the neuroscience and basic science on brain research, that all has been written up extensively. I don't know, again, why it doesn't get more attention, particularly among mental health professionals, including psychiatrists. Some of them do make a big point of this, but most of them don't seem to, at least what I hear from my patients who've been treated by other people in the past. So the fourth line of evidence, though, I have not seen extensive writing about. I've seen 1 or 2 people mention it. So what I've seen clinically over the last 25, 26 years is that virtually every single patient I have who's dealing with depression, who's in their 40s or older, when they have as little as a single glass of beer or a single bottle of beer, single glass of wine, a single alcoholic drink, they can actually see a decrement in their mood. And we're not talking about whether they get happier when they drink or whether they get melancholic when they drink. We're not talking about whether they have a hangover the next day. We're actually talking in the 1, 2, 3 days out from a single drink. They can see a dip in their mood. Interestingly, whether this is what we're seeing, I think we are seeing online brain cell death. When alcohol kills brain cells, they're not just keeling over immediately, they're actually dying over this exact same 24 to 72 hour time frame. One of the difficulties is most people who do social drinking are drinking a few times a week. And if they're drinking a few times a week, they have absolutely no baseline to look at the impact of a single glass of wine or a single beer. Because again, every drink is probably within 2 or 3 days of a previous drink. So what I tell people, if they haven't believed me, if the rest of this evidence isn't compelling yet, then limit their drinking to just 1 day a week. Let's say it's on Fridays. And if we see that their mood is dipping Saturday, Sunday, Monday, compared to the rest of the week, then that's usually fairly convincing evidence. I've certainly seen this 1, 2, 3 day dip in mood in people who are less than 40, but less commonly. And my belief, so again, this part is a belief, this is not verified scientific fact. My belief is younger people can get away with it because they have a bigger reservoir of neurons left in that part of the hippocampus. So they can essentially do more short-term damage without seeing repercussions, although that, again, that's probably having long-term repercussions. So that's the end of my story. Whether, on your birthday, whether on New Year's, a glass of wine or two, or a few sips of champagne is going to be harmful for people with depression. I can't guarantee that it will be bad, but again, all the evidence I've seen is so overwhelming. My recommendation for anyone with depression is, again, alcohol is not your friend. Please eliminate it from your life. And again, there is less evidence directly for impairing ADD functionality or the brains of people with ADHD, but given that some of what we mentioned last time is both ADHD and depression have a host of genetic contributors, and the genes are, for both of these conditions, it's hundreds if not thousands of genes, each having a little effect, and many of the same genes are increasing the propensity for someone to have both depression and ADHD. Again, there are some of those huge number of genes which are specific for ADD, and some are specific for depression, but the majority of them seem to predispose to either or both condition. A few other words on alcohol, when particularly, in American society, much of social life is centered around drinking. The bars are a place to meet people, a place to relax. I've seen online during sheltering in place, many people are having cocktail hours online, when they can't meet their, having a Zoom cocktail hour when they can't meet and connect with their friends. So clearly, in American society, we attach a strong positive social connection to alcohol. But one statistic that usually surprises most of the adults I work with, the CDC for every year for at least 50 years has been assessing what proportion of the American population doesn't drink at all. And when I'd ask people what they think, the common response is, well, it's a few Jehovah's Witnesses, a few Southern Baptists, Mormons, a few people from, in America, relevant Muslims, strict Muslims, small religious groups, and then there's a few people in AA who ran into problems with alcohol and avoid it. And maybe there's a few people with diabetes or other health problems that avoid it for those reasons. Maybe that's 10 or 15%. Every study that I've seen for the CDC every year for decades, it's been at least 30% of Americans who are not drinking alcohol at all. So one is, even though in certain settings it may be stigmatizing not to drink, there's a bigger pool of people not drinking out there than you may be aware of. And one of the other factors I see over time is when people cut back or stop drinking, the people that they used to be with when they were drinking aren't as fun to be around. And some people wind up either changing how they socialize with people or even changing social circles. So I have been talking now almost 20 minutes on alcohol and why it's not your friend. I'm going to leave it now for any questions anyone has. And while I'm waiting a minute for questions, I'll plug my book again, Recognizing Adult ADHD, What Donald Trump Can Teach Us About Attention Deficit Disorder. One psychiatrist I recently spoke to who read the book said, actually, if you want to read anything about Donald Trump's mental health, this has more insight into it than whatever else has been published out there. And again, some of the presentations, Facebook Lives in the coming weeks are going to be more focused on some of the content of that book starting next week. So doesn't look like there's any questions. So be safe, be sane, take care of yourself, including taking care of your mental health, and enjoy and celebrate life, but look for ways to do it maybe without a beer or a glass of wine. That's all for now. Bye.